She pointed at the ceiling fan in the master bedroom, turned to the realtor, and said, "My boyfriend and I were thinking we'd replace this with something more modern." The realtor smiled and wrote it down. I was standing in the doorway of that bedroom, holding a paper cup of water from the little hospitality table in the foyer. And the words landed on me the way cold water does when you're not expecting it, not painful exactly, just the sudden total awareness of your own skin. Because I had not been anyone's boyfriend in the 10 years since high school. Because I had not been anyone's anything. Because Jade Reston had texted me at 9:47 on a Thursday night saying she was going to an open house on Saturday morning, and did I want to come? And I had said yes, the way you always say yes when the person asking is the one whose name you typed into your first phone as a contact, and then changed to just a single letter because you couldn't look at it. The realtor's name was Glenn. Glenn had the build of a man who had played lacrosse in college and the energy of someone who very much wanted you to know that. He looked at me in the doorway and said, "And you must be the boyfriend." And he said it with one eyebrow slightly raised, the way men raise an eyebrow at other men to communicate congratulations in a single muscle movement. I opened my mouth. Jade looked over her shoulder at me, and her expression said something I could not quite decode. Something between a smile and a dare, and I said, "Yeah, that's me." That is the sentence I have been turning over ever since. Yeah, that's me. 2 words. I delivered them with the confidence of a man who had made a decision, which I had not, and with the steadiness of a man who understood what he was agreeing to, which I also had not. What I had was a paper cup of water and 10 years of unfinished business and a ceiling fan I had just promised to replace in a house I had not seen until 45 minutes ago, and I let Glenn write it all down. Here is what you need to know about Jade Reston before I tell you the rest of it, and I am going to tell you the rest of it. We went to the same high school in a suburb of Phoenix that has a Chili's and a Kohl's and not much else to recommend it. She was the kind of girl who made teachers nervous, not because she was difficult, but because she was smarter than the lesson plan and not always polite about it. She wore the same beat-up denim jacket for 3 years. She sat next to me in App English junior year and borrowed my red pen so often that by April I had just started bringing 2. She never gave them back. I never asked for them. In May of senior year, at the cast party for the school musical neither of us was in, she kissed me once behind the garage of a kid whose name I cannot remember. Pulled back, looked at me with her head tilted like she was reading something in very small print, and then said, "I think I just needed to know," and walked back inside. I drove home and lay on my ceiling for approximately 4 hours. We did not talk about it after, not in a dramatic way, not in a door-slamming way. We just moved around each other for the last 2 weeks of school with the specific careful courtesy of 2 people who have agreed, without speaking, that something has been placed on a shelf where it will live until further notice. We graduated. She went to San Francisco, I went to Tucson. We followed each other on Instagram the way you follow everyone from high school, which is to say we knew the broad shape of each other's lives without knowing anything true. She got a job at a tech company doing something that involved the phrase user experience. I became a middle school history teacher. She posted photos of foggy mornings and cocktails with herbs in them. I posted photos of the desert and book spines. For 10 years, we occupied the same 3-centimeter rectangle in each other's phones and called it staying in touch. She had moved back to Phoenix 8 months ago. I knew because she had posted a photo of the Chili's. No caption. 1,400 likes because apparently the Chili's meant something to people who had grown up here, which I had not fully understood until I saw 1,400 people confirm it, She had texted me 2 days after the Chili's photo. She said, I can't believe you're still here. I said, I can't believe you came back. She said, drinks? Sometime? I said, sure. We got drinks 3 weeks later. She told me she had left a relationship in San Francisco that she described only as, quote, a thing that had been dying for a long time, and finally ran out of reasons to keep trying. I did not push. I told her about 3 years ago and a woman named Priscilla who had told me, on a Sunday afternoon, that I made her feel like a guest in her own life and then left the same day, which had at least been honest. Jade had nodded slowly and said, the ones who know exactly what they're doing to you are the worst kind. I had looked at her and I had thought, you have no idea. In the 8 months since, we had fallen into something I did not have a label for. We got coffee on Sundays sometimes. She came to one of my school's movie nights, which is exactly as chaotic as it sounds. 43 middle schoolers, a projector that kept losing the signal, popcorn on the gym floor, and she stayed until the end and helped me fold the chairs. My roommate Marcus met her once when she picked me up for a hike and said afterward, unprompted, she looks at you like she's already decided something. I said, what does that mean? Marcus said, it means she has an answer and she's waiting to see how long it takes you to ask the question. I told Marcus he needed a hobby. Marcus said, I have a hobby. It's watching you be oblivious. 3 days before the open house, something happened that I should tell you about because it matters. She texted me at 11 p.m. on a Wednesday. Not about the house. She sent one line, do you still have that red pen? I stared at it for a while. I typed back, I think you took both of them in 2013. She replied, oh, right, then nothing. No explanation, no follow-up, no context, just, oh, right, and then silence. I set my phone on the nightstand and looked at the ceiling, and I thought about the fact that a woman who had moved back to a suburb with a Chili's and texted me at 11 on a Wednesday about a pen from 11 years ago was a woman who was thinking about 11 years ago at 11 on a Wednesday, and I thought about that for a while. And then I told myself I was projecting. And then I did not sleep particularly well. The morning of the open house, Marcus knocked on my bedroom door at 8 a.m. and said, through the wood, have fun buying a house. I said, I'm not buying a house, I'm looking at a house. He said, sure. I said, it's not a date. He said, sure. I said, she just wants company. He said, bro, she texted you about a pen at 11 at night. I did not have a response to that. Marcus said, I'm rooting for you. Text me if you need me to pretend to have an emergency. I said, goodbye, Marcus, he said from the other side of the door. It's a date. So when she texted about the open house, I said yes. I want to be honest about what I thought yes meant. I thought it meant she was going to look at a house and she wanted company the way you want company when you're doing anything adult and slightly terrifying, and I was, apparently, the person she called for that. I thought it meant I was a warm body with good opinions about crown molding. I did not think it meant boyfriend. Glenn walked us through the kitchen next. The kitchen had quartz countertops and one of those farmhouse sinks that exist to make people feel like they are living in a magazine. Jade stood at the island and said, he does most of the cooking, which was true. I had made her dinner twice in the 8 months since she'd been back, and Glenn said, oh really? What kind of food? And Jade looked at me, and she was smiling in a way I had not seen since the night behind the garage, the head tilted, reading small print look, and I said, Italian, mostly, in a voice I recognized as the voice I use when I am not sure what is happening, but I am choosing to let it happen. My phone buzzed. I looked at it. It was a text from Marcus. It said, Are you her boyfriend yet? I had, at some point between the front door and the kitchen, made the mistake of texting Marcus a single line. She just told the realtor, I'm her boyfriend. Marcus had apparently been waiting for this because the response came in 4 seconds. He said, called it. Then he said, what did you say? I had not responded to either of those yet because I was too busy standing in a kitchen being introduced to a version of my life I had not been consulted about. He sent a third one, say yes, you absolute disaster. Then, a fourth 30 seconds later, actually wait, what's the house like? Is it a good house? I looked up. Jade was pointing at the quartz countertop and saying something to Glenn about the resale value of natural stone versus composite. With the precise focus of someone who had been researching this and not sleeping, and I looked at her and I thought about the pen text at 11 on a Wednesday, and I put my phone in my pocket without answering Marcus. Then my phone buzzed again. This one was not Marcus. This one was a number I did not have saved. The preview said, hey, I know this is out of nowhere. This is Ryan, Jade's ex, from SF. I need to talk to someone who knows her. She won't answer my calls. I don't know who else to. The preview cut off there. I stood in the kitchen with that half a sentence on my screen for what felt like a long time but was probably 4 seconds. Glenn had moved on to explaining the HVAC system. Jade had her back to me. I did not know Orion. I did not know anything about San Francisco beyond what she had chosen to give me, which I now understood was considerably less than the full picture. A thing that had been dying for a long time, she had said, ran out of reasons to keep trying. She had not said his name once in 8 months. She had not said there was a Ryan. She had not said there was a Ryan who still had her number and was texting the people in her contacts at 11 on a Saturday morning. I put the phone face down in my pocket and I did not read the rest of the message. I want to be clear that this was a choice I made deliberately. I chose not to read it the same way you choose not to open a door you are not sure you have the right to open. It was not my message. It was not my story yet, if it was going to be mine at all. But I felt the weight of it in my pocket for the next 20 minutes like a stone. Glenn took us upstairs. There were 3 bedrooms. In the smallest one, which faced the backyard and had a window seat that caught the morning light in a way that should be illegal, Jade stood very still for a moment and then she said, this would be the office. She said it quietly, to herself, and then she caught me watching her and she said, a little louder, don't you think? I looked at the window seat. I thought about the red pens. I thought about Ryan, whose last name I did not know, whose half sentence was sitting in my pocket. I said, yeah, it would. My phone buzzed again. I did not look at it. Jade was looking at me in the way she had been looking at me since the garage, and I understood that whatever Ryan had to say, it was going to have to wait until I figured out what was happening in this room first. Glenn said, are we thinking joint application, or is one of you the primary? Jade said, joint. Glenn said, perfect. I can start the pre-qual paperwork downstairs. We have another showing at noon, so if you're serious about this property, I'd strongly encourage moving quickly. It's a competitive listing. The sellers have had 3 walkthroughs this week, and I expect something by end of day. He said end of day the way realtors say it. Smooth and casual and designed to press on the place where urgency lives. Jade heard it. I heard it. The clock was now visible and ticking, and I stood at the top of the stairs of a house I had been in for 40 minutes, and I understood that the next 20 minutes were going to matter in a way that the last 10 years had been building toward. Jade was already heading for the stairs. I was not. I stood in the room with the window seat and the morning light, and I did something I should have done before I walked through the front door of a house I was apparently considering buying with a woman I had not been in the same zip code as for 10 years. I thought about what joint meant. I thought about it for approximately 35 seconds, which is not very long, but was long enough to understand that I had been nodding along for the last 45 minutes as if someone else was in charge of my life, and that someone was currently downstairs asking a man named Glenn for paperwork. I went downstairs. Glenn had a laptop open on the kitchen island. Jade was standing next to him, looking at the screen with her arms crossed in a way that, on anyone else, would read as defensive. On Jade, it read as focused. I knew the difference. I had been studying the difference for 20 years. I stood in the kitchen doorway and I looked at her and I took my phone out of my pocket. I read the rest of Ryan's message. I am going to tell you what it said because it is the thing that made the next 60 seconds make sense in a way nothing else in the morning had. It said, "Hey, I know this is out of nowhere. This is Ryan, Jade's ex. From I need to talk to someone who knows her. She won't answer my calls. I don't know who else to reach out to. I think she might be making a mistake. We weren't done. I think she just panicked because I asked her to move into a bigger place and she ran instead of talking to me. And now I find out she moved home, which means she went back to whatever or whoever she was running toward. I just need to know if she's okay. I'm not trying to cause problems. I just need to know. Then, are you her boyfriend?" I put my phone back in my pocket. I said, "Jade, can I ask you something?" Glenn looked up from the laptop. Jade looked over at me. The reading small print expression. I said, "When did I become your boyfriend?" The room went very quiet. Glenn did something tactful with his attention, directing it at the laptop screen as though something important had appeared there. Jade said, "Does the timing bother you?" I said, "The timing is 10 years." She said, "I know." I said, "And you led with the ceiling fan." She said, "I panicked." I said, "You do not panic. You are the least panicking person I have ever met in my entire life." She said, "I panicked about you." She said it quickly, in one exhale, like it had been waiting at the back of her throat since the minute we walked in. I got here and I panicked. Glenn was very competent, and I panicked, and I said the first thing that came out. Glenn said, from behind the laptop, very professionally, "I can give you two some privacy." Jade said, "Thank you, Glenn." Glenn walked out to the back patio and developed a sudden interest in the yard. I looked at Jade. Jade looked at me. We were standing in a kitchen that neither of us owned in a house neither of us lived in, and the morning light was coming through the farmhouse window at the angle it comes through in October in Phoenix, low and gold. And I understood that whatever I said in the next 30 seconds was going to be something I would remember for the rest of my life, and would repeat to people at dinner tables whether it went well or not. I said, "Why did you really come back to Phoenix?" She said, "I told you." "The relationship," I said. "Jade, why did you come back to Phoenix?" She looked at me for a long moment. She said, "Because you were still here." Here is the thing I want to be honest about. Those 5 words were the single best sentence anyone has ever said to me. They were also the sentence that for approximately 90 seconds I could not let myself just have, because I had a phone in my pocket with a message from a man named Ryan who had just told me that she had left San Francisco because he asked her to move into a bigger place and she ran instead of talking to him, and that version of the story was a different story than the thing that had been dying for a long time. I said, "Jade, who is Ryan?" The reading small print expression went somewhere else, not gone. Replaced by something I had not seen before. Not guilt, not panic, It was the face of someone who has been caught carrying something heavy and is deciding whether to put it down. She said, "How do you know about Ryan?" I said, "He texted me. 45 minutes ago. He got my number somewhere. He thinks you ran." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "From him." I ran from him. I said, "He thinks it was towards something." She looked at me and she did not say anything. And I understood that she was not going to deny it. And I understood that not denying it was itself a kind of answer. And I understood that I had been standing in rooms with this woman for 8 months not asking the question because some part of me was afraid of the answer. And that the answer had just arrived in my pocket from a stranger in San Francisco, and I was going to have to do something with it. I said, "Why didn't you just tell me?" She said, "Tell you what?" I said, "That you came back for a reason." She said, "Danny, you are extremely hard to tell things to." I said, "What does that mean?" She said, "It means you would have done exactly what you're doing right now. You would have taken it apart. You would have asked for citations." She said the word citations with the exact precision of someone who has been watching me teach for 8 months and picked up the vocabulary. You would have wanted a source document. You would have needed to verify it independently before you trusted it. And I am not a primary source, Danny. I am just a person. And I did not know how to hand you something and watch you look at it sideways. I stood in the kitchen and I did not say anything for a moment. She said, "So I bought us into a house." I said, "That is not how buying a house works." She said, "I know." I panicked. I said, "You do not panic." She said, "I panic about you." Here is what happened after that. Not the version where I say the right thing immediately. The version where I am a history teacher who grew up in a suburb with a Chili's, and I have been trained by 33 years of being the person in the room who processes things carefully before speaking, and what I did with those 5 words, "I panic about you." And the preceding 4 minutes of conversation was take them apart. I asked for context. I asked out loud in a kitchen in Phoenix what exactly that sentence was supposed to mean in practical terms, given that she had not mentioned any of this in 10 years. And that for 10 years I had been in the same 3 centimeter rectangle of her phone without hearing it. And that for all she knew, I had a whole separate life by now that did not have room in it for whatever was happening in this kitchen. Jade listened to all of this. She waited until I was done. She said, very calmly, "Do you have a whole separate life that doesn't have room?" I said, "No." She said, "Okay. Then I don't understand the problem." I said, "The problem is the ceiling fan." She said, "What about the ceiling fan?" I said, "You told Glenn we were replacing it. You said my boyfriend and I. Before you said a word to me. Jade, I found out I was your boyfriend from a man named Glenn." She looked at me. Something shifted in her face, something I recognized because I had been cataloging her expressions since I was 16, and the thing that shifted was not embarrassment. It was the beginning of a laugh she was actively fighting. She said, "Danny, are you telling me your objection is procedural?" I said, "Yes," she said. "You're not objecting to the substance." I said, slowly, "No," she said. "So if I had texted you first," I said, obviously, she started laughing. She put one hand over her mouth and she laughed the laugh that had made me nervous at 16. The one that was too big for her face and did not care, and Glenn, on the patio, definitely heard it. And I stood in the kitchen and I let it happen because there is nothing to do when Jade Reston laughs at you except wait for her to finish and then say the thing you should have said first. I said, "I'm not buying a house with you today." She said, "I know." I said, "I'm not being your boyfriend for the purposes of paperwork." She said, "Obviously," I said, "but the rest of it." She stopped laughing. She looked at me. The morning light, the farmhouse window, the way she tilted her head when she was reading something. She said, the rest of it. I said, yeah. We stood there for a second. Then I went to the patio door and knocked twice on the glass, and Glenn came back in with the professional composure of a man who had seen stranger things than two people from the same high school having an argument about a ceiling fan in a house they were not buying. And I said, Glenn, I'm sorry to waste your time. We're not going to be moving forward today. Glenn said that was completely fine and that he had other parties interested, and did we want to be kept on the email list for similar properties. I looked at Jade. Jade said, yes, actually, but put it under my name only. Glenn wrote that down. We drove separately. We had driven separately because I had driven separately, which in retrospect tells you something I should have noticed about how I had been thinking about this morning. I texted her from my car before I pulled out of the neighborhood. I said, dinner this week. She replied in 2 seconds. She said, Tuesday. She said it without a question mark, and I thought, that is exactly right. That is exactly how she has always said things. And I put my phone face down on the passenger seat and pulled out of the neighborhood, feeling something I do not have a clean word for. Not happy exactly. Not relieved. Something closer to the feeling of a door you have been walking past for 10 years finally being identified as a door. Here is what happened on Tuesday. Dinner was good. The restaurant was a place I had suggested that she had been to before, which I had not known, which she found funny. We split a bottle of wine, and I asked before we ordered about Ryan, not accusatorially, just directly. I had decided on the drive over that I was not going to do the thing I usually do, which is wait for a better moment that never arrives. I asked her to tell me the actual version of San Francisco. She was quiet for a moment. Then she told me. The actual version was longer and harder than a thing that had been dying for a long time. It involved a man who was brilliant and who had loved her. She believed that, she said, she genuinely believed that Ryan had loved her. But Ryan had a map of the future that was very detailed and very beautiful, and she was in it, except the version of her that was in it was a version she had been trying to grow into for 3 years and could not, because it was not her shape. It was the shape he needed her to be. When he asked her to move into a bigger place, she understood all at once that bigger meant more permanent, and more permanent meant more committed, and more committed meant more of a gap between the person she was being with him and the person she actually was, and she had told him she needed to think, and she had thought. And what she had thought was, I have been performing this version of myself for 3 years for a man I love, and I am exhausted, and I want to go somewhere I don't have to perform. I said, why Phoenix? She looked at me. I said, you could have gone anywhere. Why Phoenix specifically? She picked up her wine glass and set it back down without drinking. She said, you know why. I said, I want you to say it. She said, Danny. I said, Jade, say it. She said, because every time I imagined a place where I didn't have to perform, you were in it. That is embarrassing, and I am saying it anyway. You have been in every version of that place since I was 17 years old, and I am done pretending that's incidental. I did not say anything for a moment. The restaurant was busy around us. Someone at the next table laughed. A waiter passed with a tray of food. The world was doing all the normal things the world does, and I was sitting across from a woman who had just handed me the thing I had been waiting for since a garage in Phoenix in 2013, and I was a history teacher from a suburb with a Chili's. And I did what I always do with something important. I felt it land, and then I said something small. I said, I replied to Ryan. She looked at me sharply. I said, that morning, in the car. Before I texted you about Tuesday. I replied to him. I told him she was okay. I paused. I told him she seemed happy. She said, that's it? I said, "That's it." She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, "Did you tell him anything about you?" I said, "I told him I was a friend." She said, very quietly, "Are you going to keep saying that?" I looked at her across the table. I thought about the garage and the pens and the 11 p.m. text and the ceiling fan and the window seat with the morning light in it and 8 months of Sundays and 43 middle schoolers and a projector that kept losing the signal. I thought about the way she had said I panic about you in a kitchen that wasn't ours, to a realtor who had been very professional about the whole thing. I said, "Probably not." She said, "Good." And she picked up her wine glass and drank from it, and I have thought about the way she said good approximately once a day since, because it was the word and the tone of a woman who had been waiting for a specific answer for a while and was not surprised to finally have it, and there is a very particular feeling that comes from being someone's expected answer, and it is nothing like what you think it is going to feel like when you're 17. It is much quieter, it is much better. We ordered dinner. We talked until the restaurant closed. The waiter had to come over twice. I paid. She did not argue. Not because she expected me to pay, but because, as she said on the way to the parking lot, she had bought us into a house that morning and she figured we were even. I laughed. It was the first time I had laughed all day without any tension under it. I told her in the parking lot about the red pens. I said, "I still have your notes from junior year English." I said it fast before I could decide not to. In a folder. I never threw them out. She stopped walking. She said, "What notes?" I said, "You used to write in the margins of your handouts. You gave me back a quiz once and you had written something in the margin, some argument about the Frost poem we were reading, about how the road not taken was actually the same road and the speaker was lying to himself about the choice he made. You gave me the quiz back and I never gave the paper back to you because I wanted to read it again and then I just kept it." She looked at me in the parking lot in the dark in Phoenix, the warm October dark that smells like dry grass and distance. She said, "You kept the quiz." I said, "I kept the note." She said, and her voice was very careful when she said it, "Danny, have you been in love with me this entire time?" I said, "Jade, I had your handwriting in a folder." She said, "That's a yes." I said, "That's a yes." I told her in the parking lot about the real shape of Priscilla, which was also longer and harder than I usually let it get, and involved 3 years of me convincing myself that the fact that someone needed you was the same thing as the fact that someone wanted you, which it is not, which I should have understood before year 3. Jade listened to all of it. When I was done, she said, "You have always done that." I said, "Done what?" She said, "Confused being useful with being loved." I said, "Did you know that about me in high school?" She said, "I kissed you behind the garage and then walked away and you let me." "Yeah, I knew." I said, "Why didn't you say anything?" She said, "I was 17. She paused. "And I think I needed you to know it yourself first." I said, "It took 10 years. She said, "I know. I came back." Here is where we are now, 3 months after the open house, in case you are wondering. We are not living together. We are not buying a house. We are not anything that has a clean name yet. Which is, I have come to understand, not a problem the way I once would have thought it was a problem. Because the things that matter between us have names that are older than the ones we are still deciding on. She still has the red pens. Both of them. I found out at dinner in November when she reached into her bag for something and they tumbled out. Both still red. Both still mine. And she looked at them and looked at me and said, in a voice that gave nothing away, I thought I might need them someday, and put them back in her bag, and that was all she said, and I have thought about it probably once a day since. Glenn, as it happens, sold the house to another couple 3 days after we walked out. I know because I am on the email list for similar properties. Glenn has been thoughtful about it, actually. He has sent 3 listings in the last 3 months, each one carefully chosen, and each one I have noticed has a window seat. I do not know if Glenn did that on purpose. I think he might have. I think Glenn has seen enough people in enough kitchens to know the ones who are going to come back. I cannot explain why I did not ask to be taken off the list. I have a theory, but I am not ready to say it out loud yet. Some things are better held in a folder for a while, until the moment is right. Have you ever walked past something for years and years and told yourself you were just being practical, just keeping expectations reasonable, just being mature about the way things are? And then one morning someone said one sentence and you realized practical had just been the word you were using so you didn't have to feel how much you wanted it? And here is the one I want you to sit with before you close this out. Is there someone in your life right now, not from high school, not from 10 years ago, but right now, this week, whose name you changed in your phone to a single letter because you could not look at the whole thing? And if you are honest, what would it cost you to text them on a Thursday night and just say you're going to look at something? Do they want to come? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if this one reached you, subscribe. Because next week I am going to tell you about the teacher-parent conference where the parent asked me out in front of 30 other parents and I said yes before I thought it through. And the aftermath of that was not simple.